Hey, and welcome, gurus, to this lesson, Network Security Groups. I'm Chase, one of your Azure training architects here at A Cloud Guru, a Pluralsight company. And it's in this lesson that we're going to start off by describing what network security groups are. And then we're going to be talking about network security groups, commonly referred to as NSGs, and the idiosyncrasies of associating those NSGs to resources inside of our virtual networks. We're then going to get into talking about the components of the security rules that we have inside of our NSGs so we can understand how we build security rules. We'll then talk about how these security rules on our NSGs impact filtering traffic inbound and outbound for our virtual networks. We'll talk about the impacts on intranetwork traffic. We're then going to talk about some extensibility that we can provide to our NSGs to provide those security rules with more intelligence. And then we're going to wrap up this lesson with some key takeaways. So without further ado, let's get started. NSGs are ways of controlling flows of traffic for virtual networks, specifically to the resources that live inside the subnets of our virtual networks. Now, these NSGs allow us to filter that traffic inbound and outbound for our resources, as well as the traffic that is going from subnet to subnet within the same virtual network. And NSGs are managed at the subnet level and the network interface card level. Now, with our NSGs, it's important to remember that the component that is actually filtering the traffic are the security rules that we use to allow and deny traffic for our virtual networks. And what we're doing in these security rules is providing layer 4 rules using a 5-tuple hash. And what we mean by 5-tuple hash is the source IP, where the traffic is originating, and its source port, the destination IP of where the traffic is destined for and its port, as well as the protocol in use, such as HTTP, SSH, these TCP and UDP protocols. Now that we understand what network security groups are, let's get into talking about the idiosyncrasies of associating those NSGs to resources. Let's use this example here where we have a VNet with a single subnet and 2 virtual machines, each with a single network interface card. When it comes to understanding association of NSGs, we have to understand that NSGs are scoped to the virtual network. And this means that we're talking about managing these NSGs by associating them with subnet boundaries, which then applies them to all of the network interface cards of all those resources inside that subnet, or specifically to a network interface. And NSGs can be associated to multiple subnets or network interface cards at the same time. So we could have NSG on the subnet and that same NSG associated with other subnets or with network interface cards. And something else that's important to consider with our resources and NSGs and how they're associated is that NSGs are specifically only to be associated with resources that exist inside of the same region, such as East-US. And if we were to move these resources to another region, well, these NSGs would no longer be existing to protect our resources, and we cannot move NSGs to another region. It is not supported. So the quick fix for this would be to get a template downloaded of the NSG and redeploy that NSG to the new region to protect our resources. Now that we understand the idiosyncrasies of associating NSGs to our resources, let's take a look at actually the components of our NSG security rules. When it comes to our NSG security rules and their components, we have to first think about what we're doing. And what we're doing is filtering traffic for our networks. Let's say, for example, we have the 0.0.0.0/0 representing the internet and the 10.0.0.4/32 representing the private IP that is configured on the network interface of our virtual machine here inside of this VNet. Now, when we're filtering traffic, we can specify source IP, destination IP, source and destination port, and protocol, be that TCP or UDP, to create our security rules. So that's one of the components there, is specifying those 5-tuple hashes to filter traffic. And the next thing that we have to do is name our rules, and we typically name them based on their function. For example, if we wanted to deny traffic over SSH port 22, well, we would probably name that rule something like deny port 22 or deny SSH traffic from anywhere, such as we've done here where we're denying that port 22 from the internet to our virtual machine. And if we wanted to create a rule where we're allowing port 80 for HTTP traffic, we might give it a similar naming convention so that all of our rules are named accordingly based on what function they provide for our network and its security. Now, something else we're seeing with these rules that we've just created on the NSG for this virtual network that's associated at the subnet level is that we have an action that we specify as a component of those security rules. And what we're talking about is our allow or deny action, where we determine if we are allowing or denying traffic inbound and outbound using those filtering parameters, such as the 5-tuple hash for source and destination IP, source and destination port, and the protocol in use, such as HTTP or SSH in this case. And let's say we have a situation where we want to establish the priority so we know the order of operations for evaluating the security rules that we have in place. Now, something important to understand is that the lower the number of the rule, the higher the priority when it comes to security rules. So let's say we have a client that we want to connect to our virtual machine over port 22 so that we can perform administrative tasks. Well, we might create a security rule that represents our public IP address for the client that we're connecting from, and it will allow us to connect to the destination IP of the virtual machine over port 22, allowing the ephemeral ports in return for SSH traffic. And whenever we do this, we can set the priority for this rule to be a lower number than the priority of the deny port 22 rule, so that this rule will be evaluated first, so that we're specifically allowing port 22 from this client and denying it from everywhere else. Now, the priority numbers are not 0 and 1, but I'm just using this to conceptualize your understanding of assigning a lower priority number to establish a higher priority in the order of operations when evaluating these rules. Now that we understand the components of NSG security rules, let's actually take a look at an NSG security rule table. So when administering our NSG security rules inside of the Azure portal, this is what we'll see here. We'll see a table with our inbound security rules as well as our outbound security rules. And whenever we're looking at these, it's important to remember that NSGs are stateful in nature, meaning that if the traffic is allowed either inbound or outbound, as specified by a security rule, while the return traffic inbound or outbound is also allowed. And that's something that's important to remember when evaluating how traffic is flowing through our NSGs. Now, for each of these security rules, they all are broken up into different components. We have, of course, the priority number that we talked about, right, where we're establishing the order of operations by providing rules with a higher precedence, a lower priority number. We then have the name, where we provide a naming convention to make sense of the function that our rule provides for our network. We then have the port to make up the first component of our 5-tuple hash, such as port 22, or we can specify wildcards like any to allow traffic from anywhere. And then we have our protocol that we're going to use, and this could be TCP, SSH, RDP, HTTP, any protocol to open it up for all types of TCP and UDP traffic. We then have our source, which is where our traffic is originating from, our destination, where our traffic is destined for, and the action, be that allow or deny, for the security rule and what we want to happen. Now, inside of our NSG security rule, something we need to keep in mind is that we have these default rules. We have the allow VNet inbound rule, which means that we're allowing all of the traffic that is destined for our private IP address space inbound to our virtual network. This is something that is commonly confused and thought to be we're just allowing specifically this VNet. But what we really mean by the virtual network and allow VNet inbound is all known private IP address space. Then we have the allow Azure load balancer to allow certain things that we need to happen for our virtual network so that they can work on the Azure Fabric. The deny all inbound, that is implicitly denying all inbound traffic. And then in the outbound security rules, we have similar rules that are allowing internet outbound, denying all outbound as an implicit deny, allowing VNet outbound so that this virtual network can communicate with other known private IP address space. And then we have our user-defined rules. These are the rules that exist with priority numbers between 100 and 4096. And this is where we can create rules to override the default rules that exist on every single NSG that we create. And this one in particular is allowing SSH inbound, which overrides specifically SSH traffic when we're talking about the implicit deny all inbound rule that already exists as a default rule. All right, gurus. Now at this point, we're going to split this lesson, network security groups, into 2 parts just due to the length of the lesson and the fact that I want to make sure that we cover everything. In this part 1, we talked about describing what network security groups are, talking about the idiosyncrasies involved in associating NSGs to resources, the components of NSG security rules, and inside of the next lesson, part 2 of network security groups, we're going to talk about filtering inbound and outbound traffic and how NSG security rules impact that. We'll then talk about the impacts on intra-network traffic. We'll talk about the extensibility for NSGs and additional features that are provided to provide intelligence to our NSGs. And then we'll wrap up part 2 with the key takeaways to take from this greater lesson, network security groups. All right, gurus, that's all for now. I'll see you in part 2 of this lesson.